In 2007, the Miller Kreisel factory in Chatsworth, California, went completely dark. The assembly line stopped. The remaining inventory was liquidated, and the company filed for bankruptcy. This was not a fringe hi-fi brand. This was the American pioneer of the active subwoofer. This was the company that built the reference monitors used by Skywalker Ranch to mix the cinematic audio for Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings. Dealers lost their flagship demo systems. Recording studios lost a trusted standard. A California manufacturing tradition collapsed, leaving local assembly workers unemployed and the brand's name sold off to overseas investors. A decade earlier, this badge had meant absolute trust. The paradox is that M&K did not die because America stopped listening. It died right when the American living room was buying more home theater subwoofers than at any other point in history. But the real story of Miller & Kreisel is not just the closure of a California factory. It is the story of how America learned to feel sound, and what happens when the uncompromised physics of deep bass collide with the relentless economics of mass retail. Every week, we tell the stories of the American speakers, audio brands, stereo stores, and listening rooms that once shaped how people heard music, movies, and memory. And what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place. In the high-end listening room of Jonas Miller Sound in Beverly Hills, California, in 1973. In 1973, the American stereo system had a physical limitation. Silver receivers from brands like Marantz and Pioneer were glowing in living rooms across the country, but the lowest octaves of recorded music were effectively missing. To produce deep, physical bass, a speaker needed to move massive amounts of air. That required an enormous wooden box, a heavy magnet, and a stereo receiver powerful enough to control it. Most American living rooms simply did not have the floor space for refrigerator-sized cabinets, and most affordable stereo receivers choked when asked to deliver the massive current required for low frequencies. The typical American listener accepted a compromise. The kick drum did not punch. The bass guitar did not growl. The room did not pressurize. The most dedicated audiophiles of the era often turned to the electrostatic speaker, a large panel speaker that uses static electricity to push a thin film, creating incredibly clear mids and highs but almost no deep bass. In the pursuit of absolute vocal and instrumental clarity, the low end was sacrificed entirely. The music hovered beautifully in the air, but it had no physical weight. This was the exact problem facing an elite listening institution on Wilshire Boulevard in Beverly Hills, California, called Jonas Miller Sound. Jonas Miller Sound was not a mall electronics shop. It was a high-end destination where Los Angeles musicians, recording engineers, and affluent listeners went to experience the absolute edge of high fidelity. Inside the showroom, a young audio engineer and partner named Ken Kreisel was actively trying to solve the electrostatic bass problem. He understood the physics. He knew that asking a single amplifier to flawlessly reproduce the delicate strike of a cymbal and the violent impact of a kick drum was an inherent engineering compromise. The theoretical problem became an immediate emergency when Walter Becker of the rock band Steely Dan walked into the store. It was 1973. Becker was in the middle of producing the album Pretzel Logic. He was mixing the record using electrostatic speakers because he demanded their ruthless vocal clarity. But the panels were blind in the lower registers. When Becker sat at the mixing console, he could not hear the bass guitar accurately. He could not feel the foundation of his own music. He needed a speaker that did exactly one thing: reproduce the bottom frequencies without distortion and without interfering with the delicate mid-range panels. Kreisel did not try to modify the electrostatic panels. He did not try to build a bigger conventional speaker. Instead, he built an entirely separate, dedicated wooden cabinet. Inside this heavy box, he mounted a large bass driver. But the critical innovation was not just the isolation of the driver. Kreisel took a dedicated power amplifier and integrated it directly into the cabinet. He created the active subwoofer, a dedicated bass speaker with its own internal amplifier, designed specifically to reproduce very low frequencies. When Becker wired Kreisel's raw, utilitarian prototype into the Los Angeles studio, the physical space changed. The bass guitar separated from the kick drum. The bottom end of the record gained physical weight. The mixing console finally revealed the truth of the recording. The active subwoofer had solved the Steely Dan problem. Pretzel Logic would go on to become a multi-platinum American record, its low frequencies mixed with the help of a heavy black box built in a Beverly Hills stereo shop. But the acoustic victory in the studio revealed a much larger retail opportunity. If professional recording engineers in Hollywood could not hear the bass on their own records, then millions of American consumers listening on traditional stereo pairs were completely missing the foundation of the music. Jonas Miller and Ken Kreisel realized they had not just built a custom studio tool, they had invented a completely new way to configure a stereo system. They formalized their partnership, creating Miller and Kreisel Sound Corporation. They began demonstrating their active subwoofers inside the Jonas Miller showroom, pulling affluent buyers into dedicated listening rooms to hear the difference. Traditional speaker manufacturers scoffed at the idea. The conventional wisdom of American hi-fi dictated that true full-range sound required massive, matched wooden towers. The idea of placing two small speakers on stands and hiding a black bass box in the corner seemed like a gimmick. M&K was fighting an ideological war on the showroom floor. But the physical demonstration was undeniable. Kreisel paired the heavy bass cabinet with small, highly accurate bookshelf speakers. This was the birth of the satellite subwoofer concept. The listener no longer needed two massive wooden monoliths flanking their furniture. They could place two small speakers on a shelf to handle the vocals and strings, and tuck the powered subwoofer out of sight to handle the physical impact. The concept challenged decades of retail logic. The heavy lifting of the bass was completely removed from the consumer's stereo receiver. Because the subwoofer had its own internal amplifier, the receiver only had to power the small satellite speakers. A mid-priced 30-watt receiver suddenly sounded like a premium powerhouse because it was no longer struggling to move a massive woofer. The music was cleaner. The bass went deeper. The living room required less intrusive furniture. By the mid-1970s, M&K was hand-building these subwoofers in Southern California, sourcing heavy magnets, cutting dense wood, and wiring internal crossovers. An electrical network inside a speaker that sends bass to the woofer and treble to the smaller speakers. The factory floor was small, but the reputation was spreading through the high-end Los Angeles audio network. The solution for a rock and roll record in Los Angeles had worked, but the real breakthrough would happen when Miller and Kreisel realized that the rest of America's living rooms were suffering from the exact same silence. To change the American living room, Miller and Kreisel had to convince traditional audiophiles that everything they knew about speaker cabinets was wrong. For decades, the visual language of high fidelity was defined by sheer size. If a listener walked into an American stereo store in 1977 and wanted serious bass, the dealer pointed them toward a massive wooden structure. The cabinet, the wooden, composite, or plastic box that holds the drivers and shapes how the speaker interacts with the air, had to be enormous to produce low frequencies naturally. Buyers judged the capability of a speaker by its physical footprint. Ken Kreisel's active subwoofer, a dedicated bass speaker with its own internal amplifier, designed specifically to reproduce very low frequencies, completely shattered this visual expectation. Instead of two towering monoliths dominating the floor plan, an M&K system looked almost invisible by comparison. A customer would sit on a couch in a specialized hi-fi showroom. The dealer would lower the needle on a record, and the room would instantly pressurize with deep, articulate, physical bass. The listener would instinctively look for the massive wooden towers. Instead, the dealer would point to a pair of small, unassuming boxes sitting on stands at ear level, and then point to a heavy, utilitarian cube hidden in the corner of the room. The acoustic advantage was profound. By removing the low-frequency burden from the main speakers, the mid-range driver, a driver designed to reproduce the middle frequencies where most voices and instruments live, could operate with absolute clarity. The stereo receiver did not have to struggle to move heavy bass cones. But Kreisel knew that simply putting a woofer, a large driver designed to reproduce low frequencies such as bass and drums, into a box with an amplifier was not enough. Deep bass requires moving massive amounts of air, and moving massive amounts of air usually creates unwanted mechanical noise. To solve this, M&K introduced a radical engineering solution that would become their signature, the push-pull subwoofer. A push-pull subwoofer is a design using two drivers working in opposite directions inside a single sealed cabinet to cancel out distortion. In a standard subwoofer, as the cone pushes out and pulls in at high volumes, the physical structure of the driver can introduce mechanical distortion, unwanted change added to the sound by the speaker itself. Kreisel's push-pull design mounted two heavy woofers in the same box. One driver faced outward into the room, while the other driver was mounted backward, facing into the cabinet. Because they were wired out of phase electrically but moved in phase acoustically, the nonlinearities of the moving parts canceled each other out. The result was a sealed box, a closed speaker cabinet that uses trapped air behind the woofer to control its movement, that could dig incredibly deep into the lowest octaves without the sloppy, booming overhang that plagued cheap bass speakers. The bass stopped exactly when the music stopped. It was fast, it was brutal, it was highly accurate. To bring this studio-grade engineering to the American middle class, M&K launched a product line in the late 1970s affectionately known as the Volkswoofer. The Volkswoofer was designed to be the people's bass box, retailing for around $300 in the late 1970s, roughly a week and a half of wages for an average American worker, and significantly less than a pair of massive audiophile tower speakers. The Volkswoofer democratized deep bass. It featured a built-in amplifier, a robust walnut veneer or black cabinet, and an adjustable internal crossover. An electrical network inside the speaker that sends bass, mid-range and treble to the drivers designed to handle them. This crossover was the specific American distribution breakthrough. The Volkswoofer did not require the buyer to throw away their existing stereo system. If a college student had a pair of small bookshelf speakers, or a suburban father had a set of polite acoustic suspension speakers that lacked punch, they could simply buy the M&K subwoofer, plug it into the wall, run a wire from their receiver, and instantly transform the entire room. It also solved a bitter domestic dispute. For decades, American interior designers had fought a losing battle against giant wooden speaker boxes. The M&K system allowed the heavy bass box to be hidden behind a couch or under a table because low frequencies are largely omnidirectional. The listener could not easily tell where the bass was coming from. The stereo image, the illusion that sounds come from places between and around two speakers, remained firmly anchored between the small satellite speakers while the room shuddered with invisible force. Furthermore, because bass output depends heavily on room acoustics, the way walls, floors, ceilings, and furniture change the sound after it leaves the speaker, allowing the user to place the subwoofer in a corner to physically reinforce the low end was a massive ergonomic and acoustic advantage. The American audio moat that M&K built was not just a patent. It was a physical demonstration that competitors could not easily copy. Other companies tried to sell passive subwoofers, heavy boxes that required the user to buy a massive, expensive secondary amplifier to power them. M&K offered a self-contained plug-and-play solution armed with a massive magnet structure, the magnet assembly that helps drive the voice coil and cone, delivering studio-level impact without the complexity. The badge on the grill was not decoration. It was a promise about sound. Word of this capability spread rapidly through the highest tiers of the American audio ecosystem. The M&K satellite subwoofer configuration began appearing in critical listening environments that demanded absolute truth. Elite recording facilities like A&M Records in Hollywood adopted them to hear the bottom end of their mixes. Sound stages at 20th Century Fox used them to evaluate playback. Prestigious high-end retail institutions like Lyric Hi-Fi in New York and specialized dealer networks across Chicago, Miami, and Seattle began using M&K subwoofers to demonstrate the absolute limits of analog records. The independent American stereo store became the engine of M&K's growth, allowing customers to physically feel the difference in a controlled environment. By the early 1980s, Miller and Kreisel had effectively trained a generation of critical listeners to accept that the best way to hear full-range music was to physically separate the bass from the rest of the sound. They had solved the two-channel stereo problem. The satellite subwoofer system had changed American hi-fi, but another shift was coming to the American living room, one that would demand not just accuracy, but cinematic violence. By the early 1990s, the American audio market was undergoing a massive structural shift. The traditional two-channel stereo system, built primarily for listening to records in a living room, was being absorbed by a much larger, more violent phenomenon, the American home theater. Families were moving televisions out of wooden cabinets and into dedicated suburban basements. The Laserdisc and the early DVD were introducing digital surround sound into the home. Buyers no longer just wanted to hear the music. They wanted to physically feel the impact of a cinematic explosion. This required a new kind of speaker system, and it required a new set of rules. In Marin County, California, George Lucas's production company had established THX, a strict set of acoustic and electrical performance standards designed to ensure that a movie sounded exactly the same in a commercial theater, a mixing stage, and a home living room. THX was not a speaker brand. It was a guarantee of acoustic truth. To earn the THX badge on a speaker grill, the cabinet had to play incredibly loud, handle massive dynamic swings without distortion, and tightly control how sound dispersed into the room. Miller and Kreisel did not have to invent a new philosophy to meet this standard. They had already built it. The satellite subwoofer concept that Ken Kreisel had refined in the 1970s was the exact architecture required for a THX home theater. Because the heavy bass frequencies were handled by a dedicated active subwoofer hidden in the corner, the 5 smaller satellite speakers placed around the room could be highly efficient, playing at reference volume levels without drawing massive electrical current from the receiver. M&K submitted their designs, and the resulting product line became an absolute benchmark in American audio, the M&K S150 THX system. The S150 did not look like a traditional piece of living room furniture. It looked like a piece of industrial studio equipment. It featured an array of 3 tweeters and 2 mid-range drivers mounted on a single flat baffle, surrounded by acoustic foam to stop reflected sound. Sound that bounces off walls, floors, or ceilings before reaching the listener. The S150 was designed to deliver direct sound that travels straight from the speaker to the listener, with ruthless precision. It was paired with the M&K MX series of push-pull subwoofers, heavy black boxes that could pressurize a room so violently that the physical structure of the house would shake. The American listening ecosystem immediately recognized that this was not a normal consumer product. The S150 system was adopted by the most critical listening environments on Earth. It was installed in the mixing rooms at Skywalker Ranch in Northern California. It was used on the sound stages at Sony Pictures in Culver City. It became a reference standard for audio engineers at Warner Bros. In Burbank and Disney sound facilities across Los Angeles. When an audio engineer sat at a mixing console to balance the roaring dinosaurs of Jurassic Park or the deep space engine rumble of Star Wars Episode I, They were often making those decisions by listening to a set of M&K speakers built just a few miles away in Chatsworth, California. This professional endorsement created an unprecedented halo effect in the American retail market. Elite stereo stores and dedicated home theater installers used the Hollywood connection as the ultimate sales tool. Retailers like Magnolia Hi-Fi in Seattle, Harvey Electronics in New York, and independent dealer networks across Chicago, Dallas, and Atlanta built dedicated soundproofed demonstration rooms just to showcase the M&K THX systems. For an independent stereo store, the M&K system was an economic engine. Instead of selling a customer a pair of 2-channel speakers for $800, a dealer could sell a complete THX-certified 5.1 surround sound package, 3 front speakers, 2 rear speakers, and a massive push-pull subwoofer for well over $5,000. It was highly profitable, it was physically impressive, it was the undisputed king of the premium American basement. The Chatsworth factory was suddenly operating at the absolute center of the American home theater boom. They were cutting heavy wood, sourcing massive magnets, wrapping cabinets in a signature black satin finish, and hand-wiring complex crossover networks to keep up with nationwide demand. But this growth introduced a profound systemic tension. M&K was a boutique California acoustic laboratory that had suddenly become a volume manufacturer for a booming retail sector. The dealer network was hungry for inventory. The market was expanding rapidly, and every cabinet leaving Chatsworth had to meet the exact same acoustic standard expected by the audio engineers at Skywalker Ranch. The scale was massive. The stakes were absolute. By the late 1990s, the digital versatile disc, the DVD, had officially arrived, bringing discrete 5.1 Dolby digital surround sound directly into the American home. The cultural moment was explosive. Americans were no longer just listening to records. They were building dedicated movie theaters in their basements, spare bedrooms, and living rooms. This required a physical demonstration that traditional 2-channel hi-fi simply could not provide. When a customer walked into a premium American stereo store in 1999 and sat down in a darkened, acoustically treated listening room, the dealer did not play a jazz record. The dealer put in a DVD of Jurassic Park or The Matrix. This was the defining American cultural moment for Miller Kreisel. In a suburban American basement where 2 cheap television speakers could make a cinematic explosion sound flat and distant, the M&K THX system made the helicopter rotors appear inside the room, and the heavy push-pull subwoofer made the impact physically strike the listener's chest. The room did not just get loud, the room pressurized. The dialogue remained perfectly clear through the center channel, while the low frequencies shook the floorboards. The bass was not a vague rumble. It was a tight, controlled, violent force. The customer did not just hear the movie, they survived it. The sale was often closed before the scene ended. Owning an M&K S150 system meant that a listener did not just own a high-end speaker. They owned the exact physical hardware that the Hollywood director had used to approve the final audio mix. It was the ultimate trump card in the American home theater hierarchy. At its absolute peak in the early 2000s, Miller Kreisel was shipping thousands of heavy black cabinets out of Southern California. The Chatsworth factory was a center of American acoustic manufacturing pride. Inside the building, workers were assembling massive magnet structures, wiring complex crossovers, and fitting thick, heavy, medium-density fiberboard (MDF) panels together to ensure the cabinets would not resonate under extreme acoustic pressure. M&K was supporting a massive, highly profitable dealer network across the United States. From specialized custom installers in Florida, building $100,000 home theaters, to regional audio chains in the Midwest, the M&K badge represented the ceiling of dynamic performance. The product line had expanded to include in-wall speakers, column speakers, and smaller satellite systems, but the core identity remained tied to those heavy, uncompromised black boxes. However, this absolute dominance in the premium sector created a dangerous, systemic vulnerability. Building a speaker that could meet professional THX standards required thick wood, heavy magnets, premium crossover components, and highly skilled domestic labor. The Chatsworth factory was paying California manufacturing costs, California taxes, and California wages to build a product that weighed heavily on shipping manifests: the heavy wood, the massive magnets, the strict quality control. Every single element that made an M&K subwoofer an absolute reference standard also made it incredibly expensive to produce. The company was operating at the absolute limit of what a domestic acoustic laboratory could scale into mass retail without compromising its soul. The dealer network demanded more inventory, more models, and faster delivery, all while the retail landscape outside the specialized hi-fi showroom was beginning to drastically change shape. M&K had built the American home theater standard. It had also built a target on its own back. By the mid-2000s, the internet had fundamentally changed how Americans bought audio equipment. The physical stereo store was being replaced by online marketplaces, eBay listings, and direct-to-consumer websites. For Miller and Kreisel, this lack of a physical showroom created a fatal vulnerability. If a buyer cannot physically lift the speaker or hear the violent precision of the bass before buying, they only have the visual of the badge and the price tag to guide them. This vulnerability triggered a massive, systemic counterfeiting crisis. Imagine a local American repair bench in 2005. A customer has just purchased what they believe is a discounted M&K subwoofer from an online retailer. After a few weeks of use in their home theater, the speaker stops working. The bass turns into a rattling, distorted mess, and the internal amplifier completely fails. The customer brings the heavy black cabinet into an independent stereo repair shop, expecting a simple fix for a premium American product. The repair technician places the subwoofer on the bench. They unscrew the heavy metal backplate to examine the damage. But when they look inside the wooden cabinet, the acoustic reality does not match the badge on the grille. They do not find the massive, custom-tooled magnet structure, the heavy magnet assembly that helps drive the voice coil and cone that Chatsworth was famous for. They do not find the meticulously wired crossover network. They do not find the uncompromised push-pull engineering that made the brand a Hollywood reference standard. Instead, they find a lightweight, generic woofer from a cheap overseas factory. The internal amplifier is a poorly soldered low-current board designed to fail. The cabinet itself is made of thinner, inferior particle board that vibrates and bleeds acoustic energy under pressure. The speaker is a complete counterfeit. During this era, highly sophisticated manufacturing networks in Asia began producing thousands of fake M&K subwoofers and S150 satellite speakers. They perfectly copied the black satin finish, the physical dimensions of the cabinet, and the iconic M&K logo. From the outside, the fake speakers looked identical to the studio monitors used at Skywalker Ranch, but inside, they were cheap, hollow imitations. These fakes flooded the American gray market because authentic M&K speakers were highly desirable and very expensive. The steeply discounted online prices were irresistible to consumers building basement home theaters. Buyers thought they were getting a legendary California-built THX system for a fraction of the retail cost. The consequences for the traditional American stereo store were devastating. A local hi-fi dealer in Chicago or Dallas would build a dedicated demonstration room, set up the M&K system, and give a customer an incredible sonic experience. The customer would feel the physical impact of the bass, write down the model numbers, and then go home to buy the identical-looking counterfeit online. The premium American showroom had been reduced to a free testing facility for overseas fakes. For the Chatsworth factory, the crisis was catastrophic. First, M&K lost the actual sales revenue to the counterfeiters. Second, when the fake speakers inevitably failed or sounded terrible, consumers blamed M&K. The trust that Ken Kreisel had established with recording engineers theater owners and high-end dealers was actively being destroyed by products he had never built. The THX guarantee of absolute acoustic truth was being mocked by vibrating plastic and cheap magnets wearing a stolen name. To protect the brand, Miller Kreisel was forced to spend massive amounts of capital on legal fees and private investigations. They tried to hunt down the counterfeit rings. They tried to stop the shipments at the ports. They tried to warn their American dealer network to only buy through official channels. But fighting a global counterfeiting operation requires deep corporate pockets, and M&K was a boutique California acoustic laboratory, not a multinational conglomerate. The legal battles bled the company's cash reserves at the exact moment their domestic manufacturing costs were at their highest. The system finally broke. The Chatsworth factory could no longer sustain the pressure. The California labor costs, the expensive raw materials, the shrinking network of traditional stereo stores, the unstoppable rise of cheap home theater-in-a-box systems, and the devastating financial drain of the counterfeit crisis all converged at once. The company simply ran out of money trying to defend its own reputation. In 2007, the collapse arrived. The legal bills mounted. The cash flow stopped. The dealer network fractured. The factory lines slowed. In Chatsworth, the lights went dark. The assembly stopped. The heavy wood was left uncut. The remaining inventory was liquidated. The tools were sold. The original company declared bankruptcy. The era of the American-built M&K had ended. The bankruptcy of Miller Kreisel in 2007 was the end of a California manufacturing tradition, but it was not the end of the badge. Within a year of the Chatsworth factory closing, the intellectual property, the brand name, and the remaining assets were purchased by a group of Danish investors. The company was reorganized as M&K Sound, headquartered in Denmark. The production was moved entirely offshore to Asian manufacturing facilities. The brand survived, and the new company continued to produce high-end home theater speakers bearing the iconic logo. But the physical connection to Southern California, the local cabinet shops, and the hands-on acoustic laboratory that Ken Kreisel had built in Los Angeles was completely severed. The name lived on. The American empire was gone. Today, a massive and fiercely dedicated preservation community keeps the original American era alive on vintage audio forums, Reddit communities, and specialized home theater message boards across the internet. Collectors actively hunt for original Chatsworth-built M&K systems. They scour estate sales in Florida, Craigslist listings in Texas, and eBay auctions across the country, looking for one specific detail: the metal backplate that proudly reads, "Made in Chatsworth, California." This enthusiast network includes retired stereo store dealers, professional home theater installers, recording engineers, and the children of hi-fi parents who inherited the heavy black boxes. They do not just buy the speakers, they rescue them. They trade original schematics. They document the subtle differences in crossover revisions. They recommend local repair technicians who specialize in refoaming, replacing a deteriorated foam surround on a woofer. Because original M&K drivers are considered irreplaceable, they discuss recapping, replacing old capacitors in a crossover to restore or stabilize speaker performance, to ensure the vintage S150 satellites continue to meet their ruthless THX specifications. They do not go through this trouble out of simple nostalgia. They preserve these speakers because the original equipment still matters for a very specific, functional reason. An original American M&K push-pull subwoofer, with its dense, heavy cabinet and dual custom-tooled drivers, can still do something that a modern, convenient audio system physically cannot. A modern soundbar. A long, narrow speaker system designed to sit near a television and replace multiple home theater speakers can simulate a surround effect, but it cannot genuinely pressurize a room. It cannot move massive amounts of air without distorting. It cannot anchor a cinematic explosion or a bass guitar perfectly in the physical space. Physics cannot be bypassed by a Bluetooth chip or a thin plastic tube. Deep bass requires heavy magnets, rigid wood, and serious amplifier current. The original M&K systems were built to respect those physical laws, and a restored Chatsworth cabinet still delivers absolute acoustic truth. If you drive through the San Fernando Valley today and locate the old M&K headquarters in Chatsworth, you will not find a monument to American audio engineering. The original industrial park building still stands, but it is just another beige concrete tilt-up warehouse on a quiet street. The loading docks where thousands of THX subwoofers were shipped to the most elite stereo stores in the country are now used by generic logistics companies and medical supply distributors. The listening rooms are gone. The assembly benches are gone. The physical site is entirely silent regarding its own history. But there is a surprise footnote to this California collapse. Decades after the first Subwoofer was built in a Beverly Hills stereo shop to help Walter Becker mix pretzel logic, and years after the Chatsworth factory went bankrupt, original M&K monitors remain fiercely guarded in the professional audio world. In several boutique Hollywood mixing bays and independent editing studios, engineers actively refuse to upgrade. They still use their original, battered M&K S150s and Mech Series subwoofers to mix modern film soundtracks and high-resolution album re-releases. The company that built the tools may have died in America, but the tools themselves are still quietly shaping what the world hears. The story of Miller Kreisel reveals a brutal truth about the American audio market. It highlights the profound gap between what American consumers say they value: ultimate fidelity, cinematic truth, honest engineering, and durable construction, and what the retail market actually rewards. The market rewards convenience. It rewards cheap shipping. It rewards all-in-one packaging. It rewards a good enough sound disguised by a recognizable badge. M&K built a speaker that told the absolute truth. But the American retail system could only sustain the illusion of it. They proved that a company can conquer the living room, dominate the stereo store, win the Hollywood studio, and still lose the balance sheet. Yet somewhere in an American basement, a heavy black cabinet still sits in the corner of a darkened room, its original California-built woofers, moving violently under the black satin grille cloth, perfectly pressurizing the space for one more movie. See you in the next one.